My sat in her 2016 Honda Civic, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Her 3-year-old, Sophie, had been up 4 times between midnight and 4:30, fever spiking, then breaking, then spiking again, tiny body burning against Mai's chest while she paced the apartment hallway so she wouldn't wake her husband. Lucas had an early meeting. He always had an early meeting. When he'd rolled over at 5:45 and seen her still awake, still holding the baby, he'd sighed, actually sighed, like her exhaustion was an inconvenience to his morning routine, and said, "Did you take her temperature? Did you give her medicine? What do you want me to do, Mai? I have the quarterly review today." What did she want him to do? She wanted him to see her. To notice that she hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. To understand that when he asked about the tuition payment for Sophie's preschool, the one that was now 12 days late, she didn't need a reminder. She needed a partner. Work messages. Her boss, Mrs. Tran, with her perfectly timed passive aggression, "Mai, just checking on the Q3 projections. The client meeting is at 10. Hope everything is under control at home. We really need you present today." Mai almost laughed, the kind of laugh that's one breath away from a sob. When was the last time she felt present anywhere? She was a ghost haunting her own life, going through motions that had stopped meaning anything months ago. Drop off Sophie. Drive to the office. Smile at coworkers. Answer emails. Pick up Sophie. Make dinner. Argue with Lucas about money. Pretend to sleep. Actually lie awake staring at the ceiling, cataloging every way she was failing as a mother, as a wife, as an employee, as a Christian. Especially as a Christian. She glanced at the glove compartment. She knew what was in there. She'd put it there herself, 3 years ago, after her grandmother's funeral, the small, worn, burgundy-covered Bible that her grandmother had carried to church every Sunday for 47 years. Mai had tucked it into the glove box the day after the burial, telling herself she'd read it during lunch breaks, during quiet moments, during the cracks in her day when she needed connection to something bigger than spreadsheets and diaper changes. She hadn't opened it in 6 months. Maybe longer. The truth was, prayer had become a reflex, not a relationship. God, help me. Lord, please. Jesus, give me strength. Words that used to feel like conversation now felt like throwing pennies into a dry well, waiting for a splash that never came. She'd stopped expecting answers. She'd stopped expecting anything except more silence, more exhaustion, more months of holding it together while everything inside her was coming apart. 6 months of not opening the Bible. 6 months of her faith running on fumes and muscle memory. And in those 6 months, the tuition had gone from late to delinquent. The arguments with Lucas had gone from occasional to daily. Her anxiety, the thing she used to call stress to make it sound manageable, had become a physical presence, a tightness in her chest that never fully released, a heart that raced every time her phone buzzed with another notification. She knew the statistics. She'd read the articles. Burnout among working mothers. The invisible mental load. The second shift. She could intellectualize her own unraveling with the best of them, could articulate the structural inequities and the societal pressures and the impossible expectations that had turned her life into a pressure cooker. But knowing why she was drowning didn't stop the water from filling her lungs. Sophie stirred in the back seat, her fever-flushed face pressed against the car seat strap, and I felt the familiar surge of love and terror intertwined, love so fierce it hurt, terror that she was messing this up, that her daughter would grow up remembering a mother who was always tired, always distracted, always on the edge of tears. She checked the time. 7:09. The preschool gate would open in 6 minutes. She'd hand Sophie to Miss Lynn, the young teacher with the impossibly patient smile who somehow never looked exhausted even with 12 toddlers hanging off her limbs. Then she'd drive to the office. Then she'd sit in the parking garage for 10 minutes, composing herself, putting on the mask. Then she'd walk into the building and pretend she was fine. The same routine. The same emptiness. Her hand moved to the ignition, and that's when her fingers brushed against something soft. Leather, worn smooth at the corners. The burgundy Bible. It had slid forward from the glove compartment at some point, probably during that hard stop last week when the motorbike had cut her off on Soho Street. She'd been too tired to push it back in. She didn't open it. She just let her palm rest against the cover, feeling the texture, the weight, the strange solidity of an object that had outlived her grandmother, that had witnessed decades of prayers and tears and Sunday mornings, that had been held by hands that were now folded in a grave in Bindouan province. Her grandmother's voice came back to her, unbidden, from a conversation 3 years ago, one of their last real conversations before the stroke took her words away. "You treat God like a vending machine, her grandmother had said, not unkindly, her voice crackling with age and cigarettes and a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. You put in a prayer, you expect to get what you ordered. When it doesn't come out, you shake the machine and walk away angry. But God is not a machine. God is a father. And sometimes fathers say wait. Sometimes fathers say no. Sometimes fathers say nothing because they want you to stop talking long enough to listen." Mai had rolled her eyes at the time. She was 29 then, newly pregnant, full of plans and certainties and the quiet arrogance of someone who hadn't yet been broken by life. Her eyes dropped to the page. Psalm 34. She'd read it before. Probably. She'd read a lot of things before that hadn't stuck, hadn't pierced through the armor of her competence, hadn't survived the collision with real life when real life turned out to be so much harder than the felt-board stories of her childhood had suggested. But this time, verse 18 stopped her cold. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." She read it again. Then a third time. And then, without permission, without warning, Mai started to cry. Not the polite crying she'd done at her grandmother's funeral, the kind where you dab at your eyes and apologize and assure everyone you're fine. This was ugly crying, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than sadness, somewhere she'd been keeping locked because if she opened the door even a crack, everything would come flooding out and she wasn't sure she'd survive the flood. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. Not the Lord fixes the brokenhearted immediately. Not the Lord explains why your heart had to break in the first place. Not the Lord gives you a 5-step plan to unbreak your heart so you can get back to being productive. Close. Just close. She had never actually prayed. She had worried out loud. She had recited her problems to the ceiling. She had itemized her failures like a defendant reading charges against herself. She had knelt beside her bed with her hands folded and her mind racing, listing everything that was wrong, everything she was afraid of, everything she needed God to do, and then she'd said amen and stood up and picked up every single burden she'd just named, shouldering them again before her knees were even fully straight. She had never once left anything at the foot of the cross. She had just shown God her baggage. Given him a tour of her anxiety. Let him watch her panic. And then she'd walked away with all of it still in her arms. The memory of last night surfaced like a bruise being pressed. Her husband, Min, standing in the doorway of their bedroom at 11:30, his tie loosened, his eyes carrying that exhausted resentment that had become his default expression when he looked at her. She'd been on her knees beside the bed, she remembered that, remembered the carpet fibers pressing into her skin, and he'd watched her for a long moment before speaking. "You pray all the time," he'd said, and his voice wasn't cruel, exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was empty. Every night. Every morning. "And what's changed, Mai? Is the debt gone? Is your mother's health better? Are we happy?" She'd opened her mouth to defend herself, to defend God, to say something sharp about how maybe if he tried praying once in a while instead of scrolling through his phone until midnight. But the words died in her throat. Because the horrible truth was that she'd been asking herself the same question. What had changed? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. She was still exhausted. He was still angry. The bills were still unpaid. Sophie was still sick. Her faith, which was supposed to be this anchor, this unshakable foundation, felt more like a thread she was clinging to while the thread itself frayed under her fingers. She hadn't answered him. She'd just stayed there on her knees until he sighed and turned away, and she'd heard the bathroom door close, the shower start, the water drowning out whatever sound she might have made. Now, in the car, with Psalm 34 open in her lap and tears still wet on her cheeks, I understood. She'd been treating prayer like a transaction. Insert request, receive solution. And when the solution didn't come, she felt cheated, abandoned, like God had broken some cosmic contract she'd never actually read the terms of. But what if prayer wasn't a vending machine? What if it was a surrender? The thought scared her. Surrender meant letting go. Surrender meant admitting she wasn't in control. And Mai had built her entire life on being in control, controlling her schedule, controlling her emotions, controlling the narrative she presented to the world. The idea of releasing that grip felt less like freedom and more like falling. She turned the page. Her eyes found Philippians, chapter 4, and she read the words that she'd seen on coffee mugs and wall art and Instagram posts 100 times before, words that had become so familiar they'd lost all their sharp edges. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. She'd always read it as a formula. Step 1, don't be anxious. Step 2, pray. Step 3, receive peace. Like a recipe where you follow the instructions and get the promised result. But that wasn't what it said. With thanksgiving. Even before the answer comes. Even before the situation changes. Even when your husband is still angry and your daughter is still sick and your bank account is still empty. Give thanks. Not for the pain. God didn't ask her to be grateful for suffering, but in the midst of it. Thankful that he was close to the brokenhearted. Thankful that he hadn't abandoned her even when she'd accused him of doing exactly that. The exchange wasn't prayer for solution. It was anxiety for peace. She had to give him the anxiety. Actually give it. Not show it to him and then take it back. Not describe it in detail and then continue carrying it. Give it. Release it. Open her hands and let it fall into his. And in return, he would give her peace. Not peace that made sense. Her circumstances wouldn't change, her problems wouldn't vanish, her husband wouldn't magically become tender overnight, but peace that transcended understanding. Peace that existed outside the logic of her situation. Peace that was less like a solution and more like a person. Mai closed her eyes. The preschool gate would open in 11 minutes. And in the space between one breath and the next, Mai heard it. Not an audible voice. Not a lightning bolt or a burning bush. Just a memory, surfacing through the exhaustion like a life raft breaking the surface of dark water, her grandmother's voice, thin and papery in those final weeks, when the cancer had taken everything except her certainty. Ciao ah. Faith is not about never being afraid. Faith is about daring to tell God, I am so scared, and then taking the next step anyway, because you know He is holding your hand. The memory hit Mai like a wave. Faith wasn't a performance. Faith was a hand, reaching out in the dark, trembling and uncertain, trusting that another hand was already reaching back. Mai pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. He could handle her mess. He could handle her anger. He could handle her doubt, the way she'd whispered, "Are you even listening?" into the darkness, half hoping he wasn't, because if he was listening and still not answering, what did that say about his love? He could handle all of it. She thought about the Apostle Paul, a man who'd been shipwrecked and beaten and imprisoned and left for dead, a man who'd begged God to remove some mysterious thorn from his flesh, some chronic agony that shadowed his every step. And God's answer hadn't been removal. It hadn't been explanation. It had been something else entirely. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now they hit different. My grace is sufficient. Not your strength is sufficient. Not your performance is sufficient. Not your ability to hold it all together is sufficient. His grace. Which meant she could stop. She could fall apart. She could be weak, and that was okay, not because weakness was the goal, but because his strength was most visible when hers ran out. She lifted her head and looked out the windshield. The parking lot of the preschool was filling up. Minivans and SUVs pulling into spaces, parents unbuckling toddlers, the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary Tuesday morning. And here she was, sitting in her car, having an entire theological revolution while the clock ticked toward 9. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the revolution was supposed to happen here, in the messy middle of real life, not in some pristine sanctuary with stained glass and organ music. Maybe God didn't need her to get to church to meet her. Maybe he was right here, in the 2016 Civic, in the exhaustion, in the tears, in the moment. I understood something she hadn't understood before. Peace wasn't a feeling. Peace was a person. The peace of God wasn't the absence of storms, it was the presence of a God who ruled over every storm. It was like the ocean floor, still and silent and unmoving, even while the surface raged with hurricane winds. She'd spent so much of her life trying to calm the waves, trying to control the weather, trying to manage every variable so she'd never have to feel afraid again. But she couldn't control the waves. She could only anchor herself to the one who held the depths. And her doubts, all those questions she'd been too ashamed to voice, all those moments of disappointment and confusion and quiet rage, none of it had driven him away. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't withdrawn. He'd been there the whole time, waiting for her to stop pretending, waiting for her to come to him with her actual self instead of the curated version she presented to the world. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He didn't say, come to me when you've figured it out. He didn't say, come to me when your theology is correct. He didn't say, come to me when you're no longer angry or scared or doubting. He said, come. Just come. I took a breath. Then another. And for the first time and longer than she could remember, she didn't try to fix anything. She didn't try to solve the problem or manage the situation or control the outcome. She just sat there, in the presence of God, letting herself be held. Then she spoke. Not a polished prayer. Not the kind of prayer she'd learned in Sunday school, with all the right words in all the right order. Just words, raw and honest and a little broken, spilling out of her like water from a cracked vessel. Lord, I'm coming to you not as the model believer, not as the woman who has it together. I'm coming to you as someone who is falling apart. Her voice cracked. She didn't try to stop it. I'm giving you my fear about the future. I'm giving you my disappointment in myself. I'm giving you my doubts about you, all the questions I've been too scared to ask out loud. She paused. Outside, a little boy in a dinosaur backpack ran toward the preschool entrance, his mother chasing after him with a lunchbox in one hand. I don't understand your ways. I don't know why some prayers feel answered and others feel like they're just bouncing off the ceiling. I don't have the answers. She swallowed. But I'm choosing to trust you today. Not because I'm strong. Not because I've earned it. Just because. You're faithful. Even when I'm not. You're present. Even when I can't feel you. You're working. Even when I can't see it. She closed her eyes. Give me that peace. The one that doesn't make sense. The one that exists outside my circumstances. Not so I can escape reality, but so I can face it. In your strength. Not mine. Silence settled over the car. Not an empty silence. Not the silence of absence. It was the silence of presence, the kind of quiet that happens when you finally stop talking long enough to realize someone has been listening the whole time. Amen. The word hung in the air, small and simple and somehow powerful. Mai opened her eyes. The world hadn't changed. Sophie was still sick. The bills were still unpaid. Her marriage was still strained, still fragile, still in need of more than she knew how to give. The circumstances hadn't shifted even 1 degree. But something in her had shifted.